Thank you. Thank you, Jen. Hi, everyone. I want to apologize for reading my talk. That's what we do in my discipline. It comes from a healthy respect for words and also a fear that they're going to betray us at any moment. So I want to stick close to the paper. Before I jump into my talk, I'd like to say thank you to Jen for inviting me to speak and for putting on this awesome symposium for the second year in a row. Thanks also to the student workers who helped to make this event possible. I saw Ryan and Caleb taking tickets, and I know a lot of others are working hard to make this a success. So happy Student Worker Week, you all. Finally, thanks to the other presenters who came from much farther away than I did to be here. I'm really honored to be part of this discussion of food citizenship with you all. Reading over their accomplishments has been a really humbling experience. I'm excited to learn from Steve Upson later today about growing my own food. My record in that pursuit has been appalling. Last year I killed 2 ferns in an aloe plant. I'm also looking forward to hearing about the culinary adventures of Kate Weitzel, who's going to talk about eating insects in a few short minutes. Surrounded by all of these adventurous foodies, I feel like I have to confess that I eat 2 peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for lunch every day. Suffice it to say, though, I'm not an expert on the production or even the consumption of food, but one thing I do feel qualified to talk to you all about is stories. The title of my talk today is As American as Apple Pie, Food, Citizenship, and the Stories We Tell. Now, there are some anthropologists who argue that what made us human is that we cook our food, and some anthropologists who argue that it was the capacity to tell stories that made us human. And I'd like to argue that they're both right, and that it's the marriage of these two cultural phenomenon that we share food and we share stories together that gives real meaning to our humanity. Some of the stories that are most sacred to us, that are most deeply constitutive of our cultural and spiritual identities, are, at some level, food stories. Of course, today Christians are observing Good Friday, and many of us are thinking about the story of the Last Supper, perhaps the most famous meal in history. Part of the U.S. national mythology is rooted in the story of the Thanksgiving meal, a meal shared by colonists and members of the Wampanoag tribe in Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1621. And one of my favorite food stories is not quite so well known as these two. It's the 1996 film Big Night, and it's directed by Stanley Tucci and, who's the other guy? Campbell Scott. It stars Stanley Tucci as Secundo, who's a brother, and his brother Primo, who's played by Tony Shalhoub. They own an Italian restaurant, and they're kind of struggling to keep afloat. It also has a great ensemble cast. Minnie Driver, Isabella Rossellini's in it. Mark Anthony's in this movie. It's terrific. So the setup is that the brothers are first-generation Italian immigrants. It's the 1950s or early 60s, and the restaurant is losing money. They're struggling to stay afloat. So this is a clip from that film. Just a heads up, there's some standard restaurant industry swearing in this clip, so it's a little...
Wait, the risotto? Yes, go.
Oh, thank God. Okay, here we go. Oh, just... Yeah. Oh, that looks good. You got meat with yours.
Okay.
You sure? Is this what I ordered?
Yes, that is a risotto. It's a special recipe that my brother and I bring from Italy. It's delicious, I promise.
It took so long, I thought you went all the way back to Italy to get it.
No, but it's worth it, I promise. You would like a fresh pepper or cheese?
No, I need
Cheese, yeah.
Oh, yeah,
cheese.
lots of cheese. Yeah. Excuse me, didn't you say that this was going to be rice with seafood?
Yes. It is Italian arborio rice, the best. And then with shrimp and scallop and...
I just don't see anything that looks like a shrimp or a scallop. It's just not what I expected. But I can decide on spaghetti with this, right?
What? Well, no.
Well, main course is scone spaghetti.
Well, some, yes, but you see, risotto is rice, so it is the starch, and it doesn't go really with pasta.
But I don't...
Or a side of spaghetti, that's all. An allergy report.
Yeah, I have meatballs.
Well, the spaghetti comes without meatballs.
There are no meatballs with the spaghetti?
No, sometimes spaghetti likes to be alone.
All right, then I guess we'll also have a side order of meatballs.
As a meat?
This is fine. Let's just eat. All right, then no meatballs, and we'll just have side order of spaghetti.
Primo, please, just... Come on.
I want to know for who.
Just make the salad spaghetti, please.
Secondo, I want to know for who is it for.
For the lady with the risotto.
What?
What? She likes starch. I don't know. Come on.
Bitch.
I make myself.
Why? The people in America.
I need to talk to her. Oh, please, Primo, what do you want to do? Tell the customer what she can eat, huh? That's what she wants. This is what the customer asked for. Make it. Make the pasta. Make it. Make it. Make the pasta. Come on, let's go.
How can she want it? They both are starch. Look at me. I should have made a mashed potato for another stuff.
Primo, look, no. Because they are the first customer to come in 2 hours. Fucking pipe.
No. She's a criminal. I want to talk to her.
You want to talk to her?
Okay.
You want to talk to her? That's good. You want to talk to her? Okay, good. Fine. I'm sick of this in the fucking man. Okay? You want to talk to her? Okay. Go talk to her.
No. She's a Philistine. I'm not going to talk to her. She knows how to understand anyway.
It will be trusting.
So I wanted to start with this clip because I feel like it's funny, first of all, and also because I feel like it crystallizes some interesting things about the relationship between food and citizenship, and it kind of illustrates what's at stake in the discussion of food citizenship that we're framing today. First, this clip illustrates the complex triangular relationships between food, money, and identity that are at the heart of all conversations about food. To me, discussions of food are always, at least on some level, discussions about money and social class, but they're also discussions of how we see ourselves as individuals and as members of a community. The dilemmas that Primo and Segundo face in this scene between tradition and modernity, between Italy and America, between assimilation and between food as art and food as commerce, between food as pleasure and food as survival. These are all tensions that are always simmering just beneath the surface of our everyday interactions with food. So that's the first point. The second point is that this clip shows the way that food is quickly weaponized as a tool of exclusion. Someone who doesn't eat like us is fundamentally unlike us, and they're often unliked by us. There's a repressed violence in the way that Primo acts in this scene. I love the way that the meat cleaver is sort of framed delicately by his head to illustrate the sort of like simmering violence that's just beneath the surface. Track Primo's language in this scene. He manages to insult the risotto lady 3 different times here. First, he calls her a bitch, and obviously this is a gendered insult. The gender politics of this film are a topic for a different symposium, possibly. But at the root of this metaphor is a dehumanization process that takes place. He's rendering the risotto lady into a dog. And you might think I'm being overdramatic here, but that linguistic move toward dehumanization cuts off the possibility of empathy and dialogue between them. And you see that in the conclusion of the clip where he says, there's no possible way I can talk to her, she wouldn't understand. They're beyond language at this point. The second thing he refers to her as is a criminal. And so if we think of Primo as the sovereign leader of this food nation of his mind, of his own food community, the risotto lady has violated some unwritten law that exists within that community. And so she's broken the law, and that renders her a criminal, at least in Primo's food community. And then finally, he calls her a Philistine. It's a term that we use to talk about people who are uncultured, boorish, but it's also a way of saying you are from a different nation. And that's 3 different ways that Primo is drawing borders between himself and this other person, the risotto lady. There's no possibility for constructive dialogue. And these 2 people are represented as citizens of 2 different food nations, and those nations are clearly at war here. On a more personal level, though, this triptych, Primo, Secondo, and the risotto lady, are all me. And I don't want to make too many presumptions about you all, but I bet they're all you too. Sometimes I'm the risotto lady, a food libertarian. I want to use money to buy food as a commodity without thinking about what's proper or local or even ethical. And I want to cover it all in an unnaturally orange processed cheese. Other times, I feel Primo's sense of food fundamentalism. There's a right way to eat that's rooted in a set of inflexible values and traditions that are far more important than money. Most of the time, though, I'm secundo, feeling caught between an unhealthy and self-destructive consumerist approach to food and a rigid purism that seems socially, culturally, and economically untenable in our modern world. If any of my critical theory students are here, this is also a classic id, ego, superego triptych dynamic here that's taking place, so that's kind of just a food for thought. All of this brings me finally to the central topic of my remarks this morning, which is the concept of food citizenship, which also happens to be the theme of the symposium, and I'd like to kind of springboard from what Jen said about that concept initially. Aside from talking about stories, the other thing that humanities scholars bring to the table is a valuable skill of taking a concept and worrying it to death through overthinking and overanalysis. When Jen approached me about speaking at this symposium, my first thought was, yes, absolutely, and my second thought was, wait, what is food citizenship anyway? To answer that question, I did some research, and then I did some thinking and writing, and here are the three things that I came up with, and that I'll spend a little more time unpacking. The first is that the concept of food citizenship is new, but it's already deeply contested. And I think there's a lot at stake in determining what this concept actually means and how we're defining it. It's kind of an article of faith for me at this point, but I'm really convinced that the words we choose and the rhetoric we use make a real difference in the way we think about the world and our capacity to act justly and ethically in it. One of the things I tell my writing students every semester is that before we can have arguments about policy, about what we should and shouldn't do when it comes to things like food, we have to agree on basic definitions of key concepts. And hopefully by the end of this talk, we'll have a better shared understanding of the definition of food citizenship. The second point is that there are some really significant problems with the idea of food citizenship, which are common to most understandings and most definitions of the concept. I think food citizenship is a powerful concept, but as a rhetorical framework for the food movement moving forward, I think it needs some critical attention. The final point I want to make is that good stories can help us to create better food citizens and better food communities. I'm biased because I'm in the humanities and stories are my bread and butter, but I think a good story is the last best hope for the future of life on this planet. So, like any good humanities scholar, to understand food citizenship better, I took on a quick review of the relevant literature. I should say as a proviso that I'm going to be inconsistent with naming sources, but I have a bibliography on the last slide if anyone's interested in following up. The first thing I learned was that the phrase food citizen and food citizenship have only become popular within the last 10 years or so. Google has this tool called the Ngram Viewer that can chart how frequently a word or phrase has appeared in books over the past several hundred years. It's pretty neat. The drawback of the Ngram Viewer is that Google's data stops in 2008. So when I went to chart the term food citizen, this is what I got. Nothing. Just out of curiosity, I decided to search a few related food concepts. So I looked for locavore, which is someone whose diet is based on local foods. And that's what I got. This is from the beginning 2000, and you can kind of see a sharp uptick as the popularity of the local food movement increased. And so that's kind of an interesting record of that movement. The second term I looked for was food justice, which is a movement to ensure that the benefits and risks of how food is grown, processed, transported, distributed, all those risks and benefits are consumed and shared equitably across different social categories. So that's food justice, and it kind of corresponds to the locavore. Then I looked at food sovereignty, which was defined at the first global forum on food sovereignty in Mali as the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and those people's right to define their own food and agricultural systems. The food sovereignty movement is one in which indigenous and formerly colonized people have been able to reclaim power over their food systems that had been lost through generations of colonialism and imperialism. It's a term that's used globally, whereas food justice and locavorism are more particular to US food politics. The last engram shows sustainable agriculture, a term that's used to describe farming and food production practices that take into account the long-term welfare of both humans and the non-human world. And I didn't pick these examples randomly, I'll circle back to them. That's interesting. I'm not sure why that decline is. We can advance a hypothesis about that maybe. This is putting them all three together, kind of comparing the relative frequency. So you can kind of see food justice is lagging behind, then food sovereignty, and then sustainable agriculture outpacing all of them in terms of citations. It's kind of a neat tool. They aren't a perfect source of information, partly because the cutoff year, 2008, but also because they only register books, which doesn't account for articles and websites that might be relevant to nonprofit organizations and so forth. Still, the earliest citation I could find anywhere where food citizenship was central was a 2005 essay called Eating Right Here, Moving from Consumer to Food Citizen by Jennifer Wilkins, who's a professor of nutrition studies at Cornell. That's the one in Ithaca, New York, not the one in Iowa. She was a past president of the Agriculture, Food, and Human Values Society. And she's kind of like been the founding figure of the discussion of food citizenship, what Foucault would call a founder of discourse. This article provides the most frequently cited definitions of food citizenship, and the facets of her original definition reappear in most other explanations of the concept. The first aspect of her definition is that food citizenship is linked to place. Food citizenship, like national citizenship, is partly bound by geography and territory. And with that sense of place comes a sense of, and this is a quote from her article, owing an allegiance to that place by birth or naturalization. In most discussions of food citizenship, that place is often a place that is smaller than a nation, for example, a bioregion. And here you can kind of see the kinship between the concept of food citizenship and the larger local food movements in the essential value of place as a concept that guides the idea of food citizenship. One tangential question that I had here was about diasporic food citizenship, the idea that we may define ourselves as food citizens of some distant territory rather than as food citizens of the territory in which we currently reside. And Primo in Big Night seems like a prime example of a citizen of a food diaspora. He's washed up in New Jersey of all places, but his allegiance remains with the foodways of his home country and not with the Philistines of this new territory. The second key aspect of the definition for Wilkins, and for many of the others that follow, is that food citizen is placed in opposition to food consumer. In this essay, Wilkins observes, the idea of food citizenship captures a shift in which consumers move beyond mere food shopping to a broader engagement with the food system in its many dimensions. Rather than passively, uncritically consuming food, the food citizen actively engages food, and there's a verb shift there. The implications here are that a good food citizen is someone with time and education to think critically about the food choices they're making. A third related part of this definition of food citizenship is the assumption that food citizens possess certain rights and responsibilities. This is from the Encyclopedia of Food and Agricultural Ethics. As food citizens, individuals are said to possess certain rights and have certain responsibilities in regard to food and the food system. And Wilkins' definition also mentions rights and responsibilities, and among those that she cites as examples are the right to safe and unadulterated food and the right to truthful product information. Among the responsibilities she describes are the responsibility to be informed about your choices as a food consumer. Finally, food citizenship is defined by a larger structure or system. In the same way that political citizenship is difficult to imagine outside of a larger system of laws and elected representatives and so forth, most discussions of food citizenship place it in relation to the market-based system of food production, distribution, and consumption. However, there's also a strain of food citizenship discourse that's been taken up by advocates for radical alternatives to that existing food system and who seek to claim citizenship in a totally alternative community. As other children of the 90s will attest, it's sometimes hard to pin down what exactly alternative means as a descriptive category. A study of the rhetoric of alternative food networks links to other concepts that have grown and diminished in popularity over the years, such as the fair trade movement, the organic agriculture movement, the anti-GMO movement, and so forth. So it's imagining this structure as an alternative structure that exists alongside or perhaps in conversation with the dominant structure of our food system, what we might think of as the industrial agricultural system. To this point, the conversation about food citizenship has taken place mostly among scholars, but there are some signs that nonprofit organizations are taking up the rhetoric of food citizenship. For example, the nonprofit organization Why Hunger, which is obviously a global anti-hunger organization, uses food citizenship in their kind of core messaging. They have an article on their website about 12 things you can do to be a better food citizen. That article, incidentally, is written by Jennifer Wilkins, who is sort of the founder of this food citizenship discourse, and so you can kind of see her influence in this whole conversation. Some universities are also using food citizenship language in their student programming. For example, University of Michigan recently announced a food citizen project that works to provide first-year students an early immersion in food systems. And their agenda for that project is up on that slide if you're interested in how that works. And then obviously also this larger food symposium that we're all taking part in is kind of establishing the bona fides of food citizenship as a concept that has rhetorical weight. So ultimately, while it's not yet a household term, it seems like food citizenship is growing in popularity as a conceptual framework for talking about food among scholars, activists, and students, and their teachers. And so I think it's important at this point to do a critical assessment of some of the weaknesses of this framework and to identify ways that we can improve our thinking and discussion and teaching about what it means to be a food citizen. And so in this next section, I'm going to don the self-righteous indignation of Tony Shalhoub's Primo, the chef, pull down the cleaver from the rack, and hack into some of the nastiest bits of the food citizenship rhetoric, the parts that bother me the most. This image, many of you might recognize, it's a print by Esther Hernandez, and it's a protest piece against pesticide spraying in California. It was 1979. You can't read the text down there. It says, unnaturally grown with insecticides, miticides, herbicides, fungicides. My thesis for this criticism section is that you can invite food citizenship to your party, but you have to make sure he brings his friends. And his friends are food justice, food sovereignty, and sustainability. These three other concepts are really essential for smoothing the rough edges of food citizenship as an operating framework for the food movement. My first criticism of the concept of citizenship as it's most commonly deployed in rhetoric today is that it's not a particularly active concept. If I were to conduct a Family Feud-style survey of the rights and responsibilities of citizenship, I'd probably end up with a list of really very boring stuff, like voting, paying my taxes, not breaking the law, educating myself about the issues, and so forth. And there's a definite overlap between these things and the things that food citizens are supposed to do. As good food citizens, we're supposed to vote for ethical food with our dollars. We're supposed to educate ourselves about the source of our food. Of course, these are very meaningful things, and I don't mean to discount the work that's been done to address these as frames. But crucially, they're all things that we do as individuals. And by focusing on individual empowerment and agency, food citizenship can obscure larger structural barriers to transformational change, like, for example, corporate power. Two critics of alternative food discourse, Sprague and Kennedy, argue that, quote, a tendency to overemphasize awareness-based solutions seems to prevent food citizens from accounting for the numerous political, cultural, and economic barriers to localizing the food system. This, to me, is where food citizenship needs to be linked to the discourse of food sovereignty. Food citizenship as a concept asks us to exercise our individual agency in the food system, but I think it's also important for people to recognize the places where they or where their fellow citizens may have very minimal control over their own food choices. Similarly, a concept of food citizenship that centers individual choices may also prevent us from seeing solutions in collective action. In contrast to a citizenship rooted in our individual power, Stuart Lockey argues for a food citizenship that's expressed through participation in, quote, social arrangements based on solidarity and coordinated action. We see this debate between individual and collective action play out in the environmental movement at large, where individual action often isn't enough to solve problems of a planetary scale, like species extinction and climate change. And you can kind of tell which side I'm on. I'm obviously biased in this debate. The 50 things you can do to save the Earth model of transformation through individual action isn't sufficient as a means of addressing global environmental crisis, and I don't think it's sufficient for the problems facing our food system either. The second criticism is that citizenship is a category that's defined by exclusion, and I think ultimately dehumanization, as we saw with Primo, of non-citizen others. The consequences of that exclusion are keenly felt in our food system today. In Iowa and across the United States, a significant amount of the food we eat is harvested, processed, cooked, and subsequently cleaned up by non-citizens. Undocumented workers in our food system are targets for all kinds of violence and exploitation, including wage theft, unsafe working conditions, detention and deportation, and so forth. This is a system that desperately needs food justice, and I think that some concept of food justice needs to be close at hand anytime we talk about food citizenship. Unless our conversations about food citizenship, the stories we tell about food, center the marginalized and excluded voices, we will reproduce those patterns of exclusion. There's some terrific literature that does this work of creating a more inclusive conception of food citizenship. Helena Maria Viramonte's 1997 novel, Under the Feet of Jesus, which depicts the lives of Mexican-American farm workers in California. More recently, in 2015, Delicious Foods by James Hannaham, which is about modern slavery in the American food industry. And I wish I had time to dig deeply into these texts, but suffice it to say, I think they offer ways to bring a richer understanding of food justice to our discussions of food citizenship. My final criticism is closely related to the individualist bias that I cited in my first criticism and the exclusionism that I cited in the second, and that is that citizenship, as it's most commonly understood, is an anthropocentric concept. The focus on individual action and consciousness and the way that most people think of citizenship tacitly excludes non-human others. As part of my own journey towards southern Iowa food citizenship, I recently purchased a lamb, not a live lamb, it had been butchered. And I suppose I wasn't thinking about the lamb as a fellow citizen when I packed its legs into my freezer. But is that lamb a food citizen? Is a sequoia tree a food citizen? These aren't purely academic questions. There are ongoing court cases across the globe that are adjudicating matters of citizenship for animals and plants. And to me, building an equitable and sustainable future for our food system requires a radical reconception of citizenship, one that encompasses all living things. And this is where I think that our concept of food citizenship needs to be conceptually wedded to a concept of sustainability or sustainable agriculture that takes into account the long-term interests of non-human nature. So where does that radical reconception of food citizenship come from? This is where it gets tricky. I spent some time describing a concept, food citizenship, then critiquing it, and now I have to offer some hopeful alternative. I thought about dropping the mic and making a beeline for the door, but then I realized, hey, I can outsource this most difficult part of the discussion to all of you. And so I plan to do that with crayons in just a minute now. I said that both national citizenship and food citizenship consist of a strange bouillabaisse of geography, politics, and storytelling. By geography, I mean the material space or territory of the nation or community, and by politics, I mean primarily the power to distribute resources and goods, as well as harms and risks. Stories are the way, though, that we understand the relationships between ourselves, the land we inhabit, and the resources we draw from that land, the way that we understand the relationship between politics, geography, and ourselves and our communities. For ourselves as individuals and for the communities to which we pledge our allegiance, stories are maps for navigating reality. In his influential 1983 book, the political scientist Benedict Anderson described the modern nation-state as, quote, an imagined community. He writes, quote, the members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, yet in the minds of each lives the image of their communion. Where Anderson goes with this is to say that the imagination of this community of the nation is made possible by a collective narration that takes place for him in print media. In other words, a nation comes into being by writing about itself as a nation, and we come into being as citizens by writing about ourselves as citizens of a nation. Food, of course, plays a vital role in the stories that we tell about the nation. The book Falafel Nation by Yael Raviv, for example, looks at the way that Israeli nationalism has used food, like falafel obviously, to solidify a 20th century Israeli national identity. The title I hastily chose for my talk, American as Apple Pie, refers to the not at all historically accurate idea that apple pie is a uniquely American dish as a way to solidify American identity. And that myth in turn gets bound up in the story that American soldiers in World War II would tell journalists that they were going to war for mom and apple pie. All of which is to say that food and nationalism go together like fish and chips. But Anderson's argument that social relations on the scale of the nation must be imagined and ultimately narrated also holds true for just about any network of food relations. Before we can create new food communities and new forms of food citizenship, we have to imagine them. This is just my second year living here in Iowa, and I'm finding it better than I had imagined. I grew up in New Jersey, which is like the Mordor of the industrial food system. If you're eating something with chemical additives and artificial flavors and preservatives, you're probably eating a little bit of New Jersey. I went to graduate school, on the other hand, in Eugene, Oregon, where vegan breakfast is like a way of life. And so when I first arrived in Lamoni last year, I was used to navigating different foodways. Still, finding good food here was a chief concern. My neighbors last year, Karen Gergley, who teaches art, my English department colleague Tim Robbins, his wife Jessie, and their son Malcolm, they were also new to Lamoni. And part of the narrative, the story that we told about ourselves that year as a small community of neighbors, was a story of our establishment of a kind of food citizenship in this place. Our journeys as a small neighborly community took us to some unlikely places, to an intercultural fair a few weekends ago where students shared food from their home countries and told their own food citizenship stories, to the Made Right where I discovered the loose meat sandwich, to the Spread, the Community of Christ community meal, monthly community meal open to all, to Lamoni's weekly farmers market, and I see some familiar faces from the farmers market, and thank you all for those who continue to make that a reality. In spite of these transformative experiences that I had as a new food citizen of Southern Iowa, there are also some giant gaps in my food citizenship story. And if I can make this claim as a fairly new resident, I think there's some gaps in the stories that we as a community tell about ourselves. I was missing the stories of labor, the people who work the land, harvest the food, and also the people who serve it and clean it up afterward. I was missing stories about power and about sovereignty, the ways that people are asserting control over the decisions that affect their food. And also I was missing the stories often of the land itself, its history, the web of relations that connect the plants and animals and the human beings that call us home. Ultimately, I believe that creating better food citizenship and better food communities begins with the stories we tell, and in identifying the stories that aren't being told and finding ways to tell them and to tell them better. Like I said, I'm hoping that we can invent some new stories here and begin to tell a better story with some crayons and markers if there's time for that. Yeah, we good? So here's the instructions. Oh, I missed that part, but missed that. What I'd like you to do is take 5 minutes to draw your food utopia. And as you sketch, consider the following things. How do you envision the connections between food producers and food consumers in your community? What rights and responsibilities would citizens have in your food utopia? And I have a cube here that I'm going to flip for 5 minutes. After the 5 minutes are up, I'm going to ask you to do a difficult thing for 9:30 in the morning, which is to talk to someone next to you. And I want you to talk to them about your drawing. And then I want you to take it home and hang it on your fridge. Cube has spoken. So at this point, I'd like you to turn to someone who's close by you, 2 or 3 other people, and take 5 minutes to share the themes that showed up on your drawing. What are the things that you put in your food utopia? And think about, as you're talking to your neighbor, where are the places that you agree? What are the commonalities in your vision of a food utopia? And where are the places that your visions come into conflict? So I'm going to flip the cube and hope you have some engaging conversation.
If we want to bring it back, I just want to take a moment to thank Dr. Dan Platt for presenting today at the symposium. So let's give him a hand.
I'll be around if anyone has questions or wants to talk about food citizenship. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the symposium. Thank you all for your attention.